Welcome to the Apple for the Teacher podcast, the true crime podcast that features the good apples and the bad apples within the school system. My name is Anna Thomas, a teacher and your host. So join me as I present school stories that are tragic, shocking, unbelievable, and outright bizarre. Hello everyone, this is episode 11 of the Apple for the Teacher podcast. Thank you for joining me today. First, I'd like to say a huge thank you to everyone following the podcast and those of you who have contacted me and given some very positive feedback. People have said they really like how I don't go into the details of grisly crimes or name the criminals or show their photos. They've also said, like me, that they've been so surprised by the stories that have occurred within schools. People have asked me various questions about the podcast, so I think what I might do is a Q&A episode at some point down the track. So if you've got any questions, get in touch with me and I'll organise that for the future. So let's start with a preview of the stories today. Story 1 is the bad apple and is called Boot Camp. Alex was having a great time on camp, or was he? Story 2 is the good apple and is called Runaway Bus. The out-of-control bus was heading straight for the students. What happened? First, I need to provide a warning that this story involves an incident involving a child and may not be suitable for everyone. For this story, we go to a school in Melbourne, Australia in 2016. A group of Year 11 students from the Huntington Tower School were getting ready for a week-long school camp. The camp was being held at the Plumbago station in the state of South Australia. It's an outback sheep and cattle station which covers 2,000 square kilometres, and the school had been holding the camp there for 40 years. It's located about 400 kilometres or 250 miles from the capital city of Adelaide. The purpose of the camp was to build students' leadership and team building skills and formed part of the school's outdoor education program. The camp brochure stated, quote, "This program has been designed to provide you with an opportunity to look at yourself as you move into the final stages of your secondary education, both as an individual and how you contribute as a member of a community. It will introduce you to the beauty, remoteness, and sometimes harsh realities of the outback areas that exist in Australia." End quote. The camp was a well-known and much anticipated school institution, so the students were very much looking forward to the adventure. They had prepared for the camp months ahead. Each student had been given an information booklet outlining the camp itinerary. The school also held an information evening for the parents. The students would be going on a 60-kilometre or 37-mile hike, which would span over 4 days, spending nights at various campsites along the way. They had participated in training walks at school prior to the camp in preparation for the hike. Each student carried a backpack. It was policy for the male students to carry a backpack weighing 17 kilograms and the females 13 kilograms. Including the water that they carried, the backpacks weighed up to 24 kilograms. On the first day of the hike, the group walked 6.5 kilometres before reaching their campsite for the night. The temperature on that day had reached 36 degrees Celsius or 97 degrees Fahrenheit. The next day, the group planned a 14-kilometre or 9-mile walk to their next campsite. 16-year-old Alexander was one of the students on the hike. After a few hours of walking, he began to feel fatigued and was starting to fall behind the group. He complained of feeling hot and tired and stopped frequently to drink from his water bottle. At one point, he lay on the ground appearing to have difficulty breathing. After the group had a break, Alex was placed at the front of the group so that he wouldn't lag behind. At 1 p.m. in the afternoon, the temperature reached 35 degrees Celsius or 95 Fahrenheit. Alex stopped frequently, trying to catch his breath. But as the day wore on, his condition deteriorated and his breathing became fast and shallow. He had drunk all of his water, but continued drinking from other students' water bottles. He seemed very tired and confused. One of the teachers gave him some gastrolyte, which is an electrolyte for dehydration. His pulse was checked and it was very high. A wet scarf was placed around his neck to cool him down. After a break, the group continued walking and the temperature reached 39 degrees Celsius or 102 Fahrenheit by around 3 p.m. Alex's condition then deteriorated quickly. He appeared to be uncoordinated and could no longer stand, falling down onto the ground. Students described him as being delusional and incoherent. A support vehicle was called, which arrived 10 minutes later. He was placed in the car and the air conditioning was on maximum, but he was barely conscious. The teachers poured water over his body in a desperate attempt to cool him down. His breathing became laboured and he began convulsing. An ambulance arrived to attend to Alex, and also the Royal Flying Doctor Service was also called to transport him to hospital via air. This service provides emergency health care for people living in rural and remote areas of Australia, where access to doctors and hospitals is limited due to the vast distances of the outback. The paramedics worked to stabilise Alex, but he went into cardiac arrest. Despite attempts to resuscitate him, Alex sadly passed away. The Flying Doctor Service was notified that the 16-year-old boy had died and turned back mid-flight. The school principal made the following statement to the school community, quote, "It is with heavy hearts that I inform you of the sad passing of Year 11 student on the camp to Plumbago Station. Our thoughts, sympathies and prayers are with the student's family and friends and with the students and teachers who were there on the camp. The camp has been cancelled and the students are returning to school. Counselling is being provided for the students and staff and the wider school community. It is a very, very sad day for us with the loss of this wonderful young man." The students were bussed home. They journeyed through the night, taking 14 hours to return home at 6 a.m. the next day. The reunion between the students and their parents was very emotional. The school's principal said, quote, "Parents talked and consoled each other while waiting for the buses, and it was a very moving reunion. It's horrible to say that tragedies bring people closer together, but that is what happens. The message I gave to parents is to love your kids and hold them close. You never know what's going to happen in the next instant. It's important that you're happy that whatever you say to somebody might be the last thing they hear. It could be the last time you ever see that person. There is really nothing that we can do to alleviate the pain of the boy's parents. I wish we could, but this is the worst possible situation." End quote. The coroner's report found that although Alex had been suffering from a viral infection, it was likely that he died of heat stroke. He had been diagnosed with asthma 7 years earlier, but doctors didn't believe it was a major concern. He went on to further say that the circumstances leading to Alex's death were the remoteness and the lack of easily accessible medical facilities, as well as the temperature not being monitored. The staff did not check the temperature and instead worked off weekly forecasts. The coroner condemned the school for making students hike in blistering heat over long distances while carrying very heavy packs. He recommended camps should be held in the cooler months, not at the height of summer. He also recommended the school should adopt better heat stress management and limit or postpone activity according to the temperature. Following Alex's tragic death, the school's executive decided to permanently cancel the camp. As the news of the tragic death spread throughout the community, there was one person who was particularly affected. Jody had been a former student at the school, and 20 years earlier, she had attended the same camp. She had almost died herself when a camp stove exploded and she received burns to 30% of her body. Like Alex, she was flown to hospital by the Royal Flying Doctor Service, where she remained in a critical condition for almost a month. She had to endure numerous skin grafts and received compensation from the school for her injuries. Jody lost all feeling in her right arm and was also left with emotional scars and still suffers anxiety and panic attacks. With the news of Alex's death, Jody's friends and former classmates phoned her to see how she was doing, as they knew she would be affected. Jody remembered the camp hike very well. She said it was very physically demanding and the harsh desert environment was not suitable to people unaccustomed to it. She said, quote, "I have always thought it was an unsafe camp, and I have always wished that they wouldn't do it. I cringe when I think of those poor kids going on that camp in the heat, in a remote location. I think this camp should have stopped 20 years ago." With many ex-students agreeing with her, but some also said that the camp was an amazing experience of self-discovery. The school's principal said that there was always a potential for something to happen when taking students into a challenging environment. He said, quote, "We do our very best with our risk management procedures to mitigate this. I don't think any organisation could say that nothing will happen. I am not making light of it, but we have to acknowledge that these things happen. But that is the nature of outdoor education. I would give my life to bring back that life. It is the most devastating thing for me, the community, and for that family. This is something they can never forget." End quote. So this all happened back in 2016, but it's not the end of the story. Just this year, 3 years after Alex's death, news came to light that his parents decided to sue the school. They accused the school of negligence, which led to their son's death, which had caused them ongoing pain, suffering, and distress. They stated that the school had failed to monitor the temperature and forced the students to march through intense heat during the hottest part of the day. They claimed the school also failed to consider their son's fitness and health, and that his death was entirely avoidable. The lawyer representing the parents stated, quote, "Alexander's parents trusted their much-loved son to the school and expected them to take care of him. Instead, he was made to march through intense heat, carrying an extremely heavy backpack. Children should never be required to perform such a strenuous activity in such hostile conditions. These children should never have been forced to hike in these temperatures. The defendant was negligent in its running of the camp, such that the deceased died and the plaintiffs suffered injury. This was an entirely avoidable death. Alexander's parents remain devastated by their son's death. End quote. Alex's parents are seeking costs for their ongoing anxiety and depression, and his father has also made a claim for loss of income. In response to the pending lawsuit, the school principal stated, quote, "The entire school community was devastated by Alexander's death. We have been in regular contact with his family over the last 2 years to offer what support we can. The welfare of our students and staff was and will always be paramount." End quote. Now, I have my own personal connection to this story. As a child, I lived close to where this occurred. This part of Australia is very well known for its heat. I can vividly remember as a child when the temperature would rise up to 40 degrees, 104 Fahrenheit, and you would get a week of temperatures like this before a cool change finally came through. As a family, we would often go on camping trips and visit many of these hot outback locations. Just to help you understand what it's like, there is one particular well-known town called Cooper Pedy, which is very rich in opals. The town was built around underground opal mining. It's so hot in this area that most of the people actually live underground. Old underground mines have been converted into homes. So that gives you some idea of how hot it is. It's a huge tourist attraction, and it's called the opal capital of the world, as 80% of the world's opals come from there. You can stay in underground hotels and underground restaurants, and there's even an underground church. So what struck me with this story is that these students had come from a very different climate, which was very cool and mild. They came from the city of Melbourne, which is at the southern tip of Australia and is well known for its chilly temperatures. So these poor students would not have been used to this heat at all. I think it was a great initiative for the school to have an outdoor education program, but a 60-kilometre hike does seem very extreme, and sadly, Alex lost his life as a result. It will be very interesting how this case pans out. It's currently before the courts, and as we know, courts cases tend to take a long time to go through the system. So I'm going to continue to monitor the story, and hopefully I can provide an update in a future episode. Let's now have a break before story 2. This story took place at the Amy Beverland Elementary School in Indianapolis, USA in 2016. It was the end of another school day. Students made their way out of school. Some were waiting in line to board their school bus. Helping the students onto the bus was the school principal, Susan Jordan. What happened next was witnessed by the bus driver. Another school bus suddenly jumped the curb and was heading towards the students who were boarding their bus. Susan pushed the students out of the way before being hit and sadly losing her life. 2 students were also hit and were taken to hospital with serious but non-life-threatening injuries and fortunately made a full recovery. The investigation that followed found that the driver had got out of her seat but failed to apply the parking brake. The bus then moved forward, mounting the curb and striking the principal and the students. The driver was found not to be under the influence of alcohol or any other controlled substance. No criminal charges were filed against her. Although there was negligence, according to the law in Indiana, negligence itself is not a crime. In response to the tragedy, all the schools in the district were closed. The governor at the time was Mike Pence, now the Vice President of the US. He said in a statement, quote, "Our hearts ache for her family, the school community, and for all the children who were fortunate enough to be a part of her world. They will never forget that Principal Jordan lived the life of a hero and can always be grateful for her service and courage." End quote. Mr. Pence and his wife Karen visited the school to pay their respects. Susan had been principal at the school for 22 years. A parent at the school said Susan was the reason he had moved his family to live in the area, because of all the good things he had heard about her and the school. Students and staff made a tribute video to Susan, thanking her for everything she had done at the school. The Board of Education said this about Susan, quote, "She had a remarkable way of making everyone she came in contact with feel valued and important. She had a passion for children that is unmatched." End quote. Many members of the school and community came to Susan's church service to pay their respects. Her brother, Bob Kelly, said, quote, "She would be so proud, but yet at the same time, she would probably be embarrassed, or she wouldn't want all this attention." End quote. One other person who attended the service was one of the little girls that Susan pushed aside and saved. She was in a wheelchair and carried a bouquet of flowers for her. Following the tragedy, the school community began discussing ways to honour Susan's memory and legacy. Some parents had the idea to suggest the school's name be changed to the Susan Jordan Memorial School. They created an online petition which was presented to the school. The school made an announcement that a decision was made not to change the name of the school. Let's look at how the school got its name in the first place. It was named the Amy Beverland School after a distinguished teacher who had worked in the school district over a number of decades. The school had been built in 1988, and they wanted to name it after a local teacher. Amy Beverland's name was eventually chosen due to her reputation of being an outstanding teacher. While I totally understand the sentiment to change the name in honour of Susan, I think that the right decision was made. In light of the tragedy, some schools looked at reviewing their bus idling policies. I personally didn't know that there was such a thing. Apparently, some schools in the US have a policy on bus idling while others don't, so it's individually a school decision to be made. The Indianapolis Public Schools released this statement, quote, "This week's tragic accident has created a ripple effect across the state. Like many other districts, Indianapolis Public Schools transportation leaders have reviewed district idling procedures and will make new recommendations to our drivers to ensure the safety of our students and staff. Previous practices allowed idling for a short time to maintain bus temperatures for optimal operation and student comfort in the winter months, but our revised standard practice will advise drivers to shut engines off when students and staff are present in an effort to reduce the risk of an accident." End quote. I find this very interesting, and I never really gave it a second thought, but whenever we get on a school bus, this bus is usually always idling so that it's cool for the students, particularly during the summer months here in Australia. I never knew some places had a policy to turn off the bus while waiting to pick up students. So even I learned something from this episode. Susan's heroic action is what made this story a good apple, and clearly it was a tragic freak accident which makes you realise this sort of thing can happen to any of us going about our normal everyday business. Now I'd like to give you a podcast recommendation. Since I found this podcast, I've just had to binge the episodes. It's so good. It's called Beyond Bizarre True Crime. It tells stories where you think, did that actually happen? I suggest that you start with episode 15, Murder on a Submarine, although they're all so good. Here's the host himself telling you all about the podcast.
This was a very memorable, shocking, and bizarre crime that happened.
Seems almost too bizarre to be true.
Charged in a bizarre,
accused of dressing up as a clown.
The bizarre twist in this
Police
story.
got the break they needed in this bizarre case.
The damage that this man has caused so far.
we've never seen anything like this.
Welcome to Beyond Bizarre True Crime. These are the stories that'll make you wonder if they came from Hollywood or if Hollywood took it from them. Available on your favorite podcast app or online at Beyond Bizarre True Crime.
So that's almost the end. Now let's look at a preview of episode 12. It's called Fort Knox and Lockdown. Here's a summary. The school is known as the safest school in America. So what makes it so safe? Students were left traumatized after a lockdown drill. What happened? So to end this episode, I will leave you with this quote. You can't teach children to behave better by making them feel worse. When children feel better, they behave better. So bye for now, and remember to be a good apple.